Hello, welcome back. So, we are kicking off 3 weeks, and maybe more than that, we're going to see, on talking about icons and icons within the Christian tradition. So, let's start here. The word icon. What do we mean when we say the word icon? Well, it's derived from the Greek, but what's important to understand about an icon is it's a picture. Now, we're going to talk about how it's more than that, but basically it's a picture. And it's a picture that can be displayed in a number of forms, and that's a little bit of what we're going to unpack today because there's kind of an interesting history here. So in order to talk about icons, we have to talk about art and the history of art between Judaism and Christianity and the Jewish Christian community that existed in between those. And so let's start with art in Judaism. Art in Judaism is governed by some pretty basic rules, a central one being that you don't make images of God. Flat out. So when God talks about not making graven images, Israel interprets that as meaning we are not to picture God. No one has ever seen God. Moses has seen sort of like the little back piece of God. Elijah has heard God in the stillness and in the silence, but nobody has seen God in order to give God particular pictorial representation. Okay, so you start there. Now, what is acceptable? A lot of other stuff, actually, and this is something that is confused at times. People think that maybe Hebrew Bible Judaism resulted in a resistance to art and a resistance to pictorial depiction, and that's not true. It's just where pictorial art and where artistic representation show up is very particular in the Hebrew Bible. So you're usually not going to have a piece of art that's just adorning your tent wall kind of thing, or adorning what later became like more established stone fortress, that kind of stuff. Instead, art and the skill of art is something that is reserved for the places of worship. And so you might remember in descriptions of the tabernacle or in descriptions of the temple, oxen show up a lot in terms of sculpture. There's pomegranates and bells sewn into the bottom of the priest's robes. So there's all kinds of like little adornments here and there, all of which are pointing back to the Ark of the Covenant and are pointing toward the presence of God, as if to say, in a visual representation, all of this stuff, all of these things are pointing us to God, because all of these things are the creaturely subjects of God, whether they are living animals or their plant life or their representations of the sun and the moon. All of this stuff is ultimately pointing us toward God. Now, as they move into a more Hellenistic period, so around the time of Jesus, there's a little bit more fluidity around some of these categories. We start putting art some places because Greek culture was more comfortable with that. And so you've got a little bit of a thin space in terms of what can and can't be shown. But then you get into Jewish Christian communities. And here's where everything gets a little wrinkled and fuzzy and everything else, which is that the incarnation of Jesus Christ overturns a lot of the expectations. We underestimate sometimes how radical a claim it was to say that that Jesus is the embodied person of God. And the reason why that's so controversial is sort of leave the God stuff out of it in some ways. Understand that what the pivotal controversy is there is if Jesus is the embodiment of God, then, as John says, we have seen God. That's the thing. That's the linchpin in all of this, is that the incarnation, by default, gives some kind of permission to have beheld God and have lived, which has never happened before in history. So, when Christian communities are starting to think about art and its representation, they start depicting Jesus, in part because Whereas they don't have the permission in the Hebrew scriptures, of which they are still faithful to depict God the Father, they do have the permission to depict Jesus because we have seen Jesus. Now, here's a couple of like scattershot pieces of information that are worth thinking about with that. One is that in the depictions of God the Father, the reason why they shy away from this isn't just because God the Father has never been seen by anyone except for God the Son, and therefore trying to depict God the Father is really complicated. But the other is the problem of that word Father, and here's why. God, the first person of the Trinity that we identify as God the Father, is referred to by a lot of things in the Hebrew Bible. God refers to God's self by a lot of titles in the Hebrew Bible. God is a rock. God is a strong tower. God is a mother. God is a jaded and frustrated spouse. God is the source of light and the source of darkness in which there is an abundance of life. God is all things and nothing. God is, God is, God is, God is, God is. God is a lot of metaphorical things. And so trying to draw down God into this like particular pictorial representation, the first person of the Trinity, you're going to end up in a big pitfall, which is that you've assigned to God characteristics that are not consistent with all that God is. You've only drawn down a part. And you might be able to see pretty quickly how, for instance, if you're only ever emphasizing the quote-unquote fatherhood of God, how you end up in a position where the only way in which you imagine the first person of the Trinity God is as a father. But that's not how God self-describes God's self. And while it is true that Jesus refers to God as Father, it's also worth noting that that was the common way to talk about God in the period that Jesus is in, and it was pretty recent. It was only in the past 200 years that people had started doing that with more consistency. You'll notice in the Hebrew Bible, there's not a lot of times where anyone in praying to God says God the Father. That's a concept that comes way later, and it's a concept that's designed to emphasize belonging to the covenant and the rightful inheritance of the covenant, which if you're in the middle of a diaspora where a bunch of people have colonized your nation and you are beholden to others, might be something that you would want to emphasize. Maybe it doesn't necessarily have to do with something that is specific to an attribute of God and is simply one of the ways in which we come to know God in a metaphorical sense. PSA. Said all I'm going to say on that one. But because of this, in the early Christian communities, there does end up being a controversy over pictorial images of Jesus, of saints, of other people, because what ends up happening is this big question over like, well, is this not just idols? Is this not just a form of graven images? We're not supposed to do that. You can fill in what's happening there. But the argument that comes back is pretty simple. We have been given permission. The incarnation gives us permission to depict not only God, but creaturely things, because God has said, bodies are good. I like bodies. I took on a body. Bodies are great. It's okay to behold them. In fact, bodies might be the means by which you behold God. This creates a lot of permission to do something with art that previously had not been considered possible. From here, we get the iconographic tradition, and this is going to split in two separate directions. The first is, for a while, everybody's doing pretty much the same thing, and they're doing the icons that you would probably think of if you've ever heard of icons before in a Christian context. You're probably thinking of like the stuff that's over the shoulder here, or even one like this one, which is really beloved to me. The Episcopal Church women here gave this to me for my ordination, and I cherish it so much. You've got Mary and Jesus together. So this is a more traditional looking icon. This is pretty common throughout the church until about the 13th century, and then the East splits one way and the West splits another. The East keeps up this kind of traditional image. The West starts getting a little bit more concrete, a little bit more realistic. So you'll notice in Eastern iconography, like hands elongate, stuff like that. In the West, we're not doing that as much. We're starting to do a little bit more like a realistic depiction. Now there's some pitfalls there because they also start doing things like picturing God the Father as a white man ruling from heaven. Okay. Or they start picturing the Holy Spirit as a dove. And the only thing that this Holy Spirit ever is, apparently, is a bird. Just flapping around, that's the picture of the Holy Spirit. Sometimes the Holy Spirit gets to be fire, every once in a while, but mostly it's a dove. Mostly it's just a white bird floating around. There is actually one image where the Holy Spirit is represented as a crucifix beaming down at Mary, but that's for the Annunciation. We're going to talk about that in a couple weeks because what's going on there? Okay, that's the basic history. That is the basic how we got here piece of this, and we are going to talk in some future videos about the modernist moves and all of that stuff, but I'd like to roll us back 1 second to talking about those early depictions of Jesus that the early Christian Jewish community engaged with. Because over the next several weeks, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of these things, but also invite some opportunities to pray with the history of these things. And so what I want to point out about those early communities is that we do not have a pictorial representation of Jesus on the cross being crucified for roughly the first 300 years of the life of the church. 300. You got to think about that a little bit. For those early communities, Jesus on the cross was not the image that they were drawn to. It was an abhorrent image. It was an image of tragedy and anger and fear and hurt. The image that they were drawn to was the image as Jesus as shepherd. Jesus as shepherd is one of the earliest depictions of Jesus that we have. I'll put in here, probably over right here, note to my future editing self, an image of the catacombs that we have where there are murals of Jesus as Good Shepherd. Sometimes you'll also see Jesus with fish, which is a pretty common early Christian symbology. And I will also insert it over here. The first time that we have a depiction, at least to our knowledge, of Jesus being crucified is on the casket of a child that had died. And it's set within a larger scene which points to the hope of the resurrection. Now, the reason why I think this is really important for us to think about is we are so centrally focused in most Christian art in the West, in our own churches, in our own homes, on Jesus the crucified. We put crosses everywhere. We think it's normal to wear a cross, a sign of execution, around our neck. The early church didn't feel that way. The early church knew people that were still up on those crosses because they had confessed Jesus as their Lord. Just worth thinking about. Worth maybe squinching your eyes a little bit at and saying, why this? And so that's the invitation that I want to make to you this week. We're not going to do a formal contemplation of icons, not yet, because we're going to spend a lot of weeks on this, friends. So if you don't like art history and praying with icons, I am sorry. Rewatch previous videos, maybe, I don't know. But we're going to spend some time on this because this is one of the most central ways in which we communicate our faith that we often pay no attention to because it's just background dressing. So what I want to invite you to do this week is to take some time and just pay attention to your world, in your own home, in the places that maybe you're going out with your mask and social distancing and all the other good stuff. Pay attention to the kind of Christian art, the iconography that's around you, and ask this very simple question. What is the point of this? Some of it's going to be really good, some of it's going to be bad, some of it's going to be mixed, but you're asking the question, what is the point of this? Because what the point of that art is tells you so much. And much of it might be things that you've never even considered. Why is Jesus hanging on the cross and a magnet on my fridge? Why is there a cross overlooking our altar in the church? An empty cross. Have a look around. Think about these things. Pray about them a bit. Ask Jesus to help you think about the art that surrounds your life. And next week we'll start talking about traditional iconography and praying with traditional icons and how to read them and understand them. Until then, bye.